The shadow of Genghis Khan's army stretched far beyond the steppe plains of Mongolia, reaching villages, towns, and cities with a menace that was as much psychological as it was physical. For families living in the path of the Mongol advance, life became a fragile balance between hope and dread. Even before the first arrow was loosed or the first wall breached, fear had already taken root, growing like a dark cloud over homes and communities. The uncertainty of what would come, the rumors of slaughter, abductions, and destruction, was often worse than the actual encounter with the invaders. For many, these weeks or months of waiting were a slow unraveling of the familiar, a torment that touched every aspect of family life. News of the Mongol army's approach traveled rapidly across the steppes and trade routes, carried by fleeing merchants, terrified messengers, or simply the whispers of neighboring settlements. Genghis Khan's reputation had preceded him, entire cities annihilated, men slaughtered, women and children taken as captives, and cultural treasures burned to ash. Story told of once thriving towns reduced to smoking ruins, with survivors either scattered or absorbed into the Mongol war machine. Families, hearing these tales, began to imagine the worst, often overestimating the immediate danger in their terror-driven minds. Mothers clutched their children, fathers consulted village elders and local militias, and the elderly prayed for deliverance, their voices trembling as they recounted previous raids from years past. The psychological impact of the Mongol advance was profound. Families were forced to make impossible decisions. Should they flee into unknown forests and mountains, risking starvation and exposure, or should they stay behind, hoping their town's defenses would be enough to repel the invaders? Those who chose to flee often faced grueling wrecks across harsh terrain, carrying only what they could grab in moments of panic. Pregnant women, children, and the infirm were particularly vulnerable, and many did not survive the journey. The flight itself became a crucible, exposing the fragility of familial bonds under extreme stress. Families who started together were often separated in the chaos, lost to rivers, ravines, or bands of apport. Unistic raiders taking advantage of the panic. For those who remained, the fear manifested in daily life. Markets emptied, homes shuttered, and fields went untilled. Families huddled inside, listening to distant hoofbeats or the echo of war cries. Every unusual sound, a bird taking flight, the clatter of a cart, or even the wind through the trees, was interpreted as a possible precursor to attack. Fathers armed themselves with whatever weapons were at hand, pitchforks, swords, even farming tools, while mothers barricaded doors and tried to calm terrified children. The air was thick with tension, and the normal rhythms of daily life were replaced by a continuous state of alert, where every knock on the door could herald doom. Rumors of the Mongol army's brutality were not mere exaggerations. They were rooted in actual strategies designed to terrorize populations. Genghis Khan understood the power of fear as a weapon. His scouts and emissaries often spread false stories or deliberately exaggerated the might of the army, hoping to weaken the resolve of cities before the first siege began. Villages that surrendered without resistance were sometimes spared, while those that resisted faced near total annihilation. Families internalized these lessons even before encountering the army firsthand. Submission might mean survival, but resistance could bring utter destruction. Parents would whisper these strategies to their children, trying to instill a cautious obedience while simultaneously wrestling with their own moral dilemmas. Even in towns with walls or fortifications, the advance of the Mongols created uncertainty. Siegecraft was a terrifying concept for many families who had never experienced organized warfare. The mere thought of catapults, flaming arrows, and cavalry charges inspired dread, magnified by the uncertainty of how long they might be besieged or whether reinforcements would arrive. Every day became a waiting game, with families rationing food, hiding valuable, and praying for either a miracle or an early end to the torment. Nights were the worst. The darkness amplified fears, and the slightest sound could trigger panic. Children cried themselves to sleep, mothers rocked infants in terror, and fathers patrolled the walls in vain hope that they could somehow protect their families from the inevitable. The cultural and emotional impact of the Mongol advance went beyond immediate physical danger. Families began to experience a profound sense of helplessness, a loss of agency that permeated every aspect of life. Elders, who once held authority and provided guidance, found themselves powerless, watching as their advice was ignored in panic or desperation. Children sensed the tension and fear, learning early that the world could shift violently in an instant, that security was fragile, and life could be extinguished without warning. Even simple domestic activities, preparing meals, tending animals, or fetching water, became acts of anxiety. Each decision weighed against potential danger. It was also during this period that many families confronted ethical dilemmas. Stories circulated of townspeople betraying neighbors or turning in fugitives to curry favor with the Mongols, highlighting the moral complexities imposed by survival under an approaching conqueror. Families had to consider whether to protect strangers at their own risk, hide valuables or treasures that could provoke wrath if discovered, and even make difficult decisions about who could flee with them and who could not. These decisions could fracture families emotionally, leaving scars that lasted generations. Amid this pervasive fear, there were also moments of resilience and solidarity. Neighbors shared food, fortified walls together, and offered comfort to those overwhelmed by terror. Families whispered prayers and recounted stories of survival from previous raids to instill courage. In these acts, the Mongol advance inadvertently fostered a temporary cohesion within communities, as shared fear bound people together even as it threatened to destroy them. Yet this cohesion was fragile, constantly threatened by the looming reality that once the Mongols arrived, everything might be lost. Ultimately, the Mongol advance represented not just a military campaign, but a psychological assault on conquered populations. The weeks and months leading up to the army's arrival were filled with anxiety, moral dilemmas, and desperate preparations. Families were forced to confront their mortality, question their values, and navigate a world turned upside down. Even those who survived the initial arrival would carry the trauma of anticipation, the memory of fear in its rawest form. In many ways, the Mongol advance was as devastating as the conquest itself, proving the power of fear could be as destructive as any weapon on the battlefield. By the time Genghis Khan's forces arrived, many families were already broken in spirit, their cohesion tested to the limit. The uncertainty had done its work, homes were abandoned, fields lay fallow, and people were exhausted by a relentless psychological siege. The physical conquest, when it finally came, was horrifying. But for countless families, the mental and emotional toll of waiting, fearing, and planning for the inevitable had already left scars that would never heal. In retrospect, the Mongol advance was more than a series of military movements. It was a deliberate orchestration of fear. It exposed families to the terrifying power of anticipation, showing how even the thought of destruction could reshape communities, redefine relationships, and permanently alter the social fabric. The families who lived through those days were survivors not only of battle, but of terror, carrying forward stories that would haunt the generations that followed. The dark reality of the Mongol advance reminds us that in the shadow of a conqueror, fear itself becomes an enemy, eroding the foundations of ordinary life. Long before the first sword is drawn, when Genghis Khan's armies finally arrived at a city or village, the terror that had built during the advance often transformed into a horrifying reality. The Mongols were unmatched in their combination of speed, strategy, and sheer ruthlessness, and their sieges were designed not only to capture territory, but to break the spirit of those who resisted. For families living within the walls or scattered across the surrounding countryside, these sieges were nothing short of catastrophic, a convergence of fear, destruction, and despair that reshaped communities forever. The Mongol approach to siege warfare was highly methodical, reflecting Genghis Khan's military genius. Cities and fortresses that attempted to resist were met with overwhelming force, and there was little room for negotiation once a settlement had resisted initial demands for surrender. Siege engines, such as catapults and trebuchets, were brought in to batter walls and towers, while engineers devised ingenious methods to undermine fortifications. Families living near the walls often bore the brunt of these attacks. Stones, fire, and arrows could rain down unpredictably, tearing through homes, markets, and workshops, leaving civilians trapped between the walls and the advancing army. Mothers clutched children in terror, huddling in basements or hidden corners, praying that the next volley would miss. Fathers armed themselves as best they could, often wielding farming tools against professional warriors, only to realize that human strength could do little against the onslaught of Mongol siegecraft. The brutality extended far beyond the battlefield. Once the walls were breached, or sometimes even before, a calculated reign of terror would begin. Genghis Khan's forces were notorious for their indiscriminate slaughter of men, particularly those who had resisted surrender. Historical accounts suggest that entire populations were sometimes exterminated as a warning to neighboring settlements, a tactic meant to enforce compliance without the need for prolonged sieges. Families witnessed their fathers, brothers, and sons slaughtered, often in public spaces designed to maximize psychological impact. The cries of the dying, the smoke from burning homes, and the chaos of combat created a nightmarish environment that forced civilians to confront the fragility of life in the face of an unstoppable force. Women and children faced a different but equally horrifying fate. Many were taken captive, either to be sold as slaves, forced into marriages, or pressed into service within the Mongol army or household. The trauma of separation was devastating. Mothers would watch as children were torn from their arms, sometimes never to be seen again. The uncertainty of what had happened to loved ones compounded the psychological damage. Families often didn't know whether those taken had survived, been killed, or been dispersed across the empire. Even those spared from immediate death faced years of enslavement, forced labor, or cultural erasure, their identities stripped away as part of the Mongols' conquest. The destruction was not limited to human lives. Cities were systematically looted, religious sites desecrated, and cultural treasures burned or carried off. Temples, libraries, and archives that had survived centuries of history were reduced to ashes in a matter of hours. Families who had grown up with these symbols of community and heritage suddenly found their world unrecognizable. The loss of property, homes, and cultural identity deepened the trauma of conquest. It was not merely survival that was at stake. The Mongol sieges attacked the very essence of what made a community whole, leaving families to rebuild from rubble and memory. One of the most horrifying aspects of Mongol conquest was its calculated unpredictability. Some cities, when they surrendered immediately, were spared wholesale slaughter, while others faced complete annihilation for the same act of resistance if it came too late. This arbitrary distinction created an environment of panic and confusion, as families could not reliably predict the consequences of their choices. Decisions that were made in haste, fleeing, resisting, or negotiating, could have fatal outcomes, and many families were forced to gamble with life and death under unimaginable stress. Mothers hid children, fathers surrendered themselves, and elders attempted to negotiate, all under the looming threat that any action or inaction might bring about catastrophe. The siege itself often lasted for days or weeks, each day intensifying the suffering of civilians. Food supplies dwindled rapidly, and clean water became scarce. Families were forced to ration meager provisions, sometimes resorting to eating whatever they could find: rats, tree bark, or spoiled grains, while the sounds of combat rang through the city. Disease and exhaustion claimed lives as surely as the sword. Children, unable to understand the reasons for the violence, cried endlessly, their terror mirrored by parents who felt powerless to shield them. The stress of prolonged siege created a breakdown of normal social structures as Nenni Boers turned on each other in desperation, and morality became subordinate to survival. When the final breach came, it was often accompanied by sheer horror. Mongol forces would enter the city systematically, killing men, capturing women and children, and looting what remained. Streets were soaked with blood, homes ransacked, and the remnants of the community left in shock and despair. Families were torn apart, with survivors forced to witness the fates of their loved ones or endure captivity themselves. Historical accounts describe scenes of unimaginable carnage, parents attempting to shield their children, children clinging to the bodies of their mothers, and elders wandering through ruined streets in disbelief. These images, preserved in chronicles and oral histories, reveal the profound scale of suffering inflicted during Mongol conquests. Yet, despite the overwhelming destruction, the Mongol conquest was often remarkably efficient. By instilling fear through prior knowledge of their brutality, Genghis Khan's armies frequently achieved compliance without prolonged combat. Stories of annihilated towns spread quickly, ensuring that many settlements surrendered at the first thechar, sparing themselves the worst of the violence. However, the psychological scars remained. Families who survived often carried the memory of terror for the rest of their lives. Children who witnessed the slaughter grew up with nightmares. Adults became distrustful of outsiders, and entire communities bore the collective trauma of loss and displacement. In addition to the immediate physical and emotional toll, the brutality of conquest disrupted social and political structures. Leadership was often decimated, local militias destroyed, and systems of governance dismantled. Families that had once relied on communal cohesion and local protection suddenly faced lawlessness and uncertainty. The Mongol approach was not simply about military victory, it was about dismantling resistance entirely, leaving populations vulnerable and dependent on the conqueror's authority. For families, this meant navigating a new, hostile world where survival depended on obedience, compliance, and at times, unimaginable compromises. The legacy of Genghis Khan's sieges extended far beyond the battlefield. Cities that had been centers of trade, culture, and religion were reduced to ruins. Survivors faced years of hardship as they attempted to rebuild homes, cultivate land, and restore community life. Generations were shaped by the memories of violence, trauma, and loss, carrying forward stories that blurred the line between history and myth. Families who had once lived ordinary lives found themselves defined by a single catastrophic event, the moment the Mongol army arrived and shattered everything they had known. In the end, the brutality of siege and conquest under Genghis Khan was not only a demonstration of military might, but also a psychological weapon. Families were torn from their familiar lives, subjected to unimaginable violence, and forced to confront the fragility of human existence in the face of overwhelming power. The Mongol campaigns left indelible marks on the landscape and the people who survived, a testament to the terrifying efficiency of one of history's most formidable conquerors. For those caught in the path of his army, survival was only the first step. The memory of brutality would haunt families for generations, shaping identities, communities, and histories in ways that extended long after the last arrow was loosed. The conquest of cities and villages by Genghis Khan's Mongol armies was only the beginning of the suffering for many families. Once the initial shock of siege and slaughter had passed, a new and insidious form of devastation took hold: the systematic separation of families, the enslavement of men, women, and children, and the imposition of forced labor. For those who survived the immediate violence, the reality of life under Mongol domina was often even more harrowing, as ordinary people were stripped of agency, identity, and the bonds that had once held their families together. The separation of families was deliberate and calculated. Mongol conquerors understood that destroying the social fabric of a community was just as effective as any sword in asserting dominance. Men of fighting age were often executed or conscripted to the Mongol army. Those who survived might find themselves pressed into service as soldiers or laborers, fighting in campaigns far from their homes and families. Fathers and brothers were torn from their villages, leaving behind wives, mothers, and children to cope with both the psychological trauma and the practical challenges of survival without male protection. Women and children were herded into captivity, sometimes to be taken thousands of miles across the Mongol Empire, their fates entirely determined by the whims of their captors. Families, once inseparable, were suddenly scattered across vast territories, often with no hope of reunion. The abduction of women and children had both immediate and long-term consequences. Women were often sold as slaves, forced into marriage, or compelled to serve in Mongol households. Some were chosen for concubinage, their lives entirely subordinated to the desires of their captors. Children were taken for a variety of purposes, as servants, apprentices, or laborers in distant lands. Historical records indicate that children were sometimes separated from their parents at the earliest possible moment, trained or indoctrinated into Mongol customs, and assimilated into households far from their communities. The psychological trauma of this separation was immense. Mothers who had survived the initial conquest would weep for children lost to foreign lands. Fathers, pressed into service or executed, left families to grapple with the uncertainty of survival and the haunting absence of loved ones. Enslavement under Mongol rule was brutal and inescapable. The Mongols had a highly organized system for categorizing and distributing captives, assigning them to households, military units, or labor projects according to age, gender, and skill. Men might be forced to work in construction, road building, or as part of the army, often enduring harsh conditions, minimal sustenance, and relentless physical labor. Women were put to work in domestic service or agricultural labor, while children were pressed into apprenticeships or servitude. Life as a slave under the Mongols was marked by constant physical and psychological pressure, as captives had no autonomy and were often treated as property rather than human beings. Families were ripped apart, bonds severed, and traditional structures of care and protection obliterated. The Mongol approach to forced labor was also practical and ruthless. Conquered populations were essential to maintaining the empire's logistical and economic infrastructure. Skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, builders, and farmers were relocated to wherever their labor was most needed. Some cities were depopulated entirely, their inhabitants transported to other regions to rebuild or strengthen strategic locations. Families that had once lived together were separated across continents, with individuals scattered to the far reaches of the empire. A father might be forced to build a fortress in Persia while his children were serving in households in China and his wife laboring in the fields of Eastern Europe. This forced diaspora disrupted the continuity of family life and imposed a profound psychological toll on all members. The cultural and emotional devastation caused by this separation cannot be overstated. Captives were stripped not only of physical freedom but of identity and community. Children grew up learning Mongol customs and language, often losing connection with their native culture and family history. Women forced into servitude were compelled to adapt to foreign households, abandoning traditions and social norms that had defined their communities. Entire generations were shaped by captivity, and the stories of lost families became a recurring thread in oral histories and chronicles. The trauma of separation and slavery lingered long after the physical conquest, coloring the memories and identities of survivors and their descendants. Even families who initially survived together faced daily hardships under the burden of forced labor. Villages were repurposed to supply the Mongol war machine with food, materials, and manpower. Men were conscripted into labor brigades or armies, leaving women to cultivate fields under the watchful eyes of Mongol overseers. Children were expected to contribute to household chores, often in brutal conditions, while the elderly were left to fend for themselves or assist in labor-intensive work. Every aspect of life became a struggle to meet the demands of conquerors, with survival taking precedence over familial bonds, cultural traditions, and personal autonomy. The emotional impact of this forced labor and separation manifested in complex ways. Families were often kept physically close but emotionally fractured, living under constant fear of death, punishment, or further dispersal. Trust within communities eroded as people competed for scarce resources or sought to curry favor with their captors to protect themselves and their loved ones. Children grew up witnessing the submission of adults, learning that survival often required obedience and compromise. These psychological scars, are compounded by the unpredictability of Mongol rule. While some captives were eventually allowed a degree of autonomy, others remained in servitude for life, leaving families to live with constant uncertainty about their future. The human cost of these policies was immense, but from the Mongol perspective, they were highly effective. By breaking up families, the Mongols eliminated potential centers of resistance and ensured a steady supply of labor for their expanding empire. Captives who were relocated could not return to rebel against Mongol authority, and the trauma inflicted on surviving populations served as a warning to others. While the conquest demonstrated military might, the systematic separation, enslavement, and forced labor ensured that Mongol control extended far beyond the battlefield, embedding fear and obedience into the daily lives of conquered peoples. The stories of families during this period are heartbreaking and illustrate the full human toll of Mongol expansion. Accounts describe mothers wandering ruined villages in search of children who had been taken, fathers enduring exhausting labor while haunted by memories of their homes, and children growing up in foreign households, longing for the family they had lost. Even for those who survived and were eventually reunited, the experience left lasting emotional scars. Trust, intimacy, and the sense of security once provided by family bonds were forever altered by the violence and dislocation of conquest. In the end, the separation, slavery, and forced labor imposed by Genghis Khan's armies created a secondary level of devastation that extended well beyond the immediate violence of battle. Families were torn apart physically and psychologically, communities were fractured, and the social fabric of entire regions was reshaped. Survival often meant submission, but even survival could not undo the trauma of loss, the pain of separation, and the relentless erosion of identity. The Mongol conquest was not merely about territory, it was about control, domination, and the destruction of any social structures that might challenge their supremacy. For the families caught in its path, the consequences were enduring and harrowing, a dark legacy that shaped generations long after the swords were sheathed, while the immediate horrors of Genghis Khan's campaigns, siege, slaughter, and enslavement are often the first aspects of his conquests that come to mind. The Mongols also waged a subtler, yet equally devastating, assault, the systematic erasure of culture and identity. For families who survived the initial onslaught, the destruction of their religious institutions, traditions, and social structures became a daily reality, a psychological and spiritual occupation that endured long after the battlefield was abandoned. This cultural erasure struck at the heart of what made communities recognizable and cohesive, leaving survivors to grapple not only with trauma, but also with the erasure of the familiar rhythms, rituals, and symbols that had once defined their lives. One of the most visible forms of cultural destruction was the deliberate targeting of religious and educational centers. Temples, monasteries, churches, and libraries were destroyed or repurposed, with invaluable manuscripts, sacred texts, and artifacts burned or carried off as spoils. These acts of devastation were not accidental. Mongol conquerors understood that the institutions that maintained collective memory and social cohesion, religion, education, and cultural heritage, were powerful symbols of identity. By destroying them, they not only weakened the spiritual foundation of a community, but also sent a chilling message. The past, the traditions, and the social hierarchy that had protected families and guided their lives could no longer be trusted to ensure survival. For families, The loss of a temple or a school was not merely material, it was deeply personal. Parents could no longer transmit knowledge, values, or faith to their children in familiar settings. Children grew up with fragmented memories of a heritage that had been violently erased, leaving a void that would haunt generations. Language, too, became a casualty of conquest. As families were scattered, children were often forced to adopt the Mongol language or local dialects of distant regions where they were sent as captives or labo. Rears. This linguistic assimilation severed ties to oral traditions, folklore, and familial narratives. Stories that had been passed down for generations, the legends of ancestors, the moral tales that guided ethical behavior, the songs sung at festivals, were at risk of being lost entirely. Parents who survived the conquests struggled to maintain continuity in storytelling, often whispering memories and traditions in secret to keep them alive. Yet, the scale of displacement and enslavement meant that many children would grow up disconnected from the culture that had once defined them. In this way, the Mongols were not only conquerors of land, but inadvertent architects of cultural amnesia, shaping populations whose connection to their heritage was permanently altered. Art, architecture, and craftsmanship were similarly targeted. Cities renowned for their artisans and skilled tradespeople were either depopulated or forced to contribute their talents to the Mongol Empire. Local styles of building, carving, and decoration were replaced or absorbed into the aesthetic priorities of the conquerors. Families who had invested their lives in passing down artisanal skills often saw their work destroyed or appropriated. Workshops that had been family-run for generations were either dismantled or forced to serve the demands of the Mongols. The destruction of tangible culture compounded the loss of intangible heritage. Family identity, local pride, and generational knowledge were all threatened, leaving survivors with an irreplaceable sense of absence. One of the most profound consequences of this cultural erasure was the redefinition of family and social roles. Traditional structures were disrupted as men, women, and children were scattered, enslaved, or co-opted into Mongol service. Roles that had once been clearly defined, father as protector, mother as nurturer, elder as advisor, were undermined by displacement and coercion. Families that remained together often had to adapt to entirely new hierarchies dictated by Mongol overseers, abandoning customs that had governed daily life for centuries. Rituals marking birth, marriage, and death were suppressed or transformed under the pressures of conquest, leaving families without the familiar markers that had once provided continuity and stability. The psychological impact of this disruption was profound, creating a sense of alienation and loss that extended far beyond the immediate trauma of violence. Religion, in particular, became a fragile element of family identity under Mongol rule. While the Mongols were often pragmatic in their approach, tolerating multiple religions if they served administrative purposes, they nonetheless targeted institutions that could inspire resistance or provide communal cohesion. Priests, NKS, and religious scholars were sometimes executed or enslaved, and sacred spaces desecrated. For families, this meant the loss of guidance, spiritual grounding, and community cohesion. Children grew up without formal instruction in faith traditions. Rites of passage became irregular or impossible to perform. Festivals and ceremonies that had bound the community together were abandoned or prohibited. The erasure of religious practice was not simply an assault on belief. It was an attack on the ways families transmitted identity, morality, and history to the next generation. Food, clothing, and local customs, small but vital markers of cultural identity, were also disrupted. Conquered populations were often relocated, forced to work in unfamiliar climates, or required to adopt new modes of dress or diet to comply with Mongol expectations. Traditional cuisine could not be maintained, local clothing styles replaced, and seasonal practices interrupted. For families, these changes were daily reminders of subjugation and alienation. Even simple acts, like preparing a familiar meal or celebrating a seasonal festival, became exercises in memory and resistance, fragile attempts to preserve identity in the face of overwhelming external control. The cumulative effect of these disruptions was a profound sense of dislocation. Survivors often experienced what modern scholars would call cultural trauma, a loss not only of safety and livelihood, but of the shared symbols, values, and traditions that give life meaning. Children grew up in a world where stories, language, and customs were incomplete or lost. Adults were forced to reconstruct daily life from fragments. Families struggled to maintain cohesion and continuity, creating adaptive strategies to survive while holding on to what little remained of their heritage. Oral histories, secret rituals, and clandestine teaching became crucial tools of resistance as families tried to preserve memory and identity even under the weight of conquest. Despite the overwhelming pressure to assimilate or conform, many families displayed remarkable resilience. In secret, parents would teach children traditional songs, retell ancestral stories, and perform rituals quietly in the home. Communities that survived often became guardians of lost traditions, passing on fragments of language, faith, and practice in ways that would ripple across generations. Yet even this resilience was shadowed by loss. The cultural landscape that had nurtured these families was gone, replaced by the imperatives of a conquering empire that valued obedience and labor over tradition and memory. Ultimately, the cultural erasure imposed by Genghis Khan's conquests demonstrates that the impact of warfare extends far beyond the battlefield. While swords, arrows, and catapults destroyed lives and cities, the more insidious destruction of identity, heritage, and memory affected families for generations. Survivors were left not only with physical scars, but with a profound sense of alienation from the past, a dislocation of identity that reshaped communities, relationships, and the way people understood themselves in the world. Families had to navigate this fractured reality while striving to survive, rebuild, and retain some sense of who they were, even as the Mongol Empire reshaped the very fabric of their lives. In this sense, the conquest of Genghis Khan was both tangible and intangible. The physical devastation was compounded by a spiritual and cultural assault that eroded the foundations of family life and community cohesion. Families who endured these campaigns faced not only immediate trauma, but the ongoing challenge of reconstructing identity in a world that had been violently remade. Cultural erasure and the loss of identity were not collateral damage. They were deliberate, calculated outcomes of a conquest designed to dominate every aspect of human life. The Mongol Empire expanded not only in territory but in the ability to control memory, tradition, and cultural continuity, leaving a legacy that would haunt conquered families for centuries. In the wake of Genghis Khan's brutal conquests, the families who survived were thrust into a world that was unrecognizable and precarious. Cities lay in ruins, fields were scorched, and villages had been emptied of life, leaving survivors to navigate landscapes of desolation, fear, and uncertainty. Yet amidst the trauma, terror, and loss, human resilience often emerged. Families found ways to endure, adapt, and sometimes even rebuild their lives, despite the omnipresent shadow of Mongol domination. Their stories of survival illuminate the complexity of human endurance in the face of systemic destruction and provide insight into how communities confronted both immediate hards and long-term consequences of empire. Survival was never simple. For many families, it began with the immediate challenge of returning to their homes, if they had homes left, or establishing new shelters amidst the wreckage. The physical environment had been radically altered. Walls were reduced to rubble, barns burned, and granaries emptied. Fields once rich with crops were stripped bare, intentionally or as collateral damage from siege and pillaging. Parents had to figure out how to feed their children, sometimes scavenging wild plants, hunting, or relying on the generosity of neighbors who had also endured. This struggle for sustenance was compounded by the presence of Mongol patrols and local collaborators whose oversight imposed limits on mobility, trade, and resource gathering. Survival required ingenuity, courage, and constant vigilance. Families also faced the ongoing threat of captivity and conscription. Even after the major conquests, Mongol authorities maintained control by relocating people. Imposing forced labor or conscripting men into military campaigns. Families had to navigate these pressures carefully, weighing compliance against resistance. Some parents attempted to hide children or elderly relatives from authorities, while others negotiated with Mongol overseers, offering labor or tribute in exchange for relative autonomy. These strategies were fraught with risk. A single misstep could lead to further separation, enslavement, or death. In this context, survival demanded both strategic thinking and an acute awareness of the shifting balance of power, turning daily life into a high-stakes negotiation with forces far beyond one's control. Psychological survival was just as critical as physical endurance. Families who had witnessed violence, separation, and cultural destruction struggled with grief, fear, and trauma. Children who had lost parents, siblings, or entire communities carried deep scars. Adults grappled with guilt for decisions that might have protected some family members at the expense of others. Coping mechanisms varied widely. Some families clung to remnants of cultural and religious practice, performing quiet rituals in homes or secret spaces to maintain a sense of identity. Others relied on oral storytelling, passing down memories of what had been lost to preserve connection and continuity. Even in extreme circumstances, these acts of cultural preservation became tools for psychological resilience, reinforcing bonds and providing meaning amid chaos. Community support emerged as a crucial factor in survival. Families often banded together, sharing scarce resources, labor, and knowledge to withstand the challenges imposed by Mongol control. Neighbors rebuilt homes collectively, cultivated fields together, and offered protection or sanctuary to those most vulnerable, such as children, the elderly, or pregnant women. These communal networks became lifelines, sustaining families not only physically but emotionally. Social cohesion provided a buffer against isolation and despair, reminding survivors that, despite the overwhelming power of the Mongol Empire, human connection could endure. Yet even within these networks, tension and fear persisted, as scarcity and the constant threat of further violence tested trust and cooperation. Adaptation also extended to economic survival. Families learned to navigate the demands of the empire by providing labor, crafts, or goods in exchange for protection or sustenance. Skilled artisans might be co-opted into workshops supporting Mongol projects, while farmers supplied crops to imperial authorities. Such arrangements were often exploitative, yet they offered a measure of security in an otherwise volatile environment. Families who could adapt to these new economic realities were sometimes able to re-establish a semblance of normalcy, creating the foundation for generational continuity despite the overarching shadow of conquest. Relocation, voluntary or forced, became a common strategy for survival. Many families moved to regions that were less directly impacted by Mongol campaigns, seeking safety in remote villages, forests, or mountains. While relocation could offer physical protection, it often required adaptation to new environmental conditions, cultures, and languages. Families had to rebuild social ties from scratch, establish agricultural practices in unfamiliar terrain, and navigate the challenges of coexistence with existing communities. This displacement reinforced resilience, teaching adaptability and resourcefulness, but it also amplified the sense of cultural dislocation, as families struggled to maintain traditions and identity while forging new lives in unfamiliar surroundings. Despite the enormity of these challenges, survival was not simply about enduring hardship. It also involved acts of agency and resistance, however subtle. Families sometimes preserved knowledge and cultural practices in secret, defying Mongol attempts to erase local identity. Children were taught ancestral stories quietly, religious observances were performed away from prying eyes, and local customs were maintained under the guise of everyday routines. Such acts of preservation were a form of resilience, demonstrating that survival encompassed more than life itself. It included the maintenance of memory, culture, and identity, even in the face of systemic oppress. Scion. Long-term survival had profound effects on family structures and community life. Generations born under or shortly after Mongol conquest inherited the dual legacies of trauma and adaptation. Families were shaped by stories of loss and displacement, but also by lessons of resilience, resourcefulness, and solidarity. Communities developed strategies to cope with political domination, including negotiation with authorities, strategic marriages, and the creation of informal support networks. Even where culture and identity had been heavily disrupted, fragments persisted and evolved, creating a complex interplay between memory, adaptation, and survival that defined post-conquest life. The shadow of the empire also left enduring psychological imprints. Survivors and their descendants carried the memory of violence, separation, and cultural erasure. These memories shaped collective identity, influencing behavior, decision-making, and social cohesion for generations. Families became hyper-aware of vulnerability, cultivating caution and prudence in dealings with authorities or outs. Idas. At the same time, the experience fostered resilience, instilling the knowledge that survival required both courage and adaptability. In this sense, the Mongol conquests created communities that were simultaneously scarred and strengthened, their identities forged in the crucible of adversity. Ultimately, the story of survival amidst the shadows of Genghis Khan's empire is a testament to the resilience of families in the face of systematic devastation. While conquest brought unimaginable violence, separation, and cultural erasure, it did not entirely extinguish human agency, love, or determination. Families adapted to new realities, rebuilt lives, and preserved fragments of their identity through ingenuity, courage, and solidarity. Their endurance reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of history, survival is not merely about existing. It is about reclaiming meaning, sustaining relationships, and maintaining continuity in the face of overwhelming disruption. The lessons of these survivors echo through history, offering insight into the profound human capacity for adaptation and resilience. The Mongol Empire reshaped the world physically, politically, and culturally, but it could not fully erase the spirit of those it conquered. Families who endured carried forward stories, traditions, and strategies for survival, ensuring that the memory of their communities and the lessons learned from adversity would persist long after the swords and arrows had faded into history. Through these acts of endurance, the shadow of the empire became a backdrop against which human courage, resourcefulness, and hope could shine, illustrating the extraordinary ways families confront catastrophe and preserve life in its fullest sense.